So a little while ago, I was thinking about Astrologian. It's getting a rework in Dawntrail, and honestly on the whole, I think that might be a good thing. As each expansion releases, what the job is in its moment-to-moment gameplay has always stayed the same. It's a healer that plays cards, but the minute details that make people love the job, rather than just treating it as White Mage 2, are constantly changing. Cards are barely recognisable from their original functions, healing has become more intricate over time, and most importantly, they've removed my time dilation. And so, I did what every self-respecting degenerate does when they're feeling some type of way. I tweeted about it. And I was expecting some people to agree because time dilation was awesome, and those people did agree. A lot more people than I expected agreed, actually. And it somehow ended up gaining over 100,000 views, which for somebody as small of a content creator as me, is kind of a lot of attention. But the thing that really surprised me and sparked what eventually became this very video is the fact that so many people had no idea that time dilation had even existed in the first place. Sometimes I forget that I'm actually a huge boomer, and that starting the game in later Realm Reborn is not actually the norm. I still use the term Heavensward baby in my head occasionally, which should give you some idea how skewed my mindset is in that regard. If you started in Shadowbringers, I don't even know what you are, but it's gotta be still in the womb or something. That got me thinking. There are a lot of removed abilities in FF14 that people have just never seen. The stylish, the wacky, the utterly pointless, the chitin. Let's look at some of them, shall we? Seeing as it's what started this whole intro, I think it's only fair that we open up with time dilation. This Astrologian ability was added in Heavensward and removed with the release of Shadowbringers, and it allowed you to extend the duration of beneficial effects you cast on a target by 15 seconds. But what's special about this is that it wasn't the only part of Astro's kit that could extend buffs. They also had Celestial Opposition, because it used to be an AoE stun that could extend the duration of beneficial effects that were cast on yourself and on party members by 10 seconds. So now let me explain how these two combined were an absolute game changer for the way that you could play this job in the first place. You could extend the effects of shields on targets, or more importantly and usefully, regens, both AoE and single target. You could delay your earthly stars popping by using it, allowing you to gain more value from a later heal without delaying its usage in the first place. Cards you played could also have their timers extended, and because back in Heavensward you could buff cards into increasing their duration, potency, or even making them AoE buffs, you can see how bonkers this can get really quickly. You can even extend potion buffs on a player in their burst window. I really hope that in the 7.x series when Dawntrail releases, Square Enix decides to play more into the time mage fantasy that early Astro embodied. As unlikely as I'm expecting that to be, it would be really cool. So tank stances used to work very differently to the way they do now. Nowadays it's a binary aggro button that you can safely keep on the majority of the time, but beforehand it wasn't that simple. You'd have a tank stance and a DPS stance. For Paladin, that was Shield Oath and Sword Oath, but each tank had some variation of this with their own flavour. Your tank stance would increase your enmity generation just like it does now, but it would also reduce the amount of damage you take, but in exchange, you'd lose the damage that you do as well. It wasn't a completely minor thing either, originally being 20% before being reduced to 15% a little later down on the road if we keep using Paladin as an example. As a wee side note, if you open your actions and traits menu, you'll actually see that little tank mastery trait. Well, that is where the passive tank stance mitigation went. Generally, you'd want to pull in your tank stance, attain an aggro lead over the DPS and healer, and then swap to DPS stance. Or maybe if you had a ninja in your party, you could use the support of Shadewalker, another removed ability that diverts 80% of the ninja's aggro to the target. You could sometimes just pull in DPS stance using that and live life on the edge and it would be okay. But Warrior was different. Warrior could use Unchained, which let them just sit in tank stance for 20 seconds with no damage penalty whatsoever. They could pull the boss, build up a huge aggro lead, then swapped to Deliverance, their DPS stance, to pump out as much damage as possible, losing nothing along the way. This made Warrior the de facto best tank to pull encounters at the start, as they could easily set both tanks up for success for the entire pull. This next one is less for function and more because something about its animation just hit different for me. Astrologian had an ability extremely reminiscent of Reprisal when it first released, being able to reduce the potency of a target's offensive actions by 5% for 6 seconds on a 60-second cooldown. This is Disable, and I love the animation so much that every time I used it, I felt cool. Square Enix did not agree, because it was removed exactly one expansion after it was initially added, not making it even as far as Stormblood. Rest in peace. Did you know Final Fantasy XIV used to have a pretty robust suite of execute abilities? Attacks that you could only use when the target was at or below 20% HP. It was usable on bosses too, making your rotation just a little bit more frantic when you reached that final push towards victory. Bards had Misery's End, Machinists had Heartbreak, Ninjas had Assassinate, which is now a downgrade of Dream Within a Dream and also used to be an execute ability in much the same way as the other two I mentioned. Warrior had Mercy Stroke too, there were a bunch of them. This still exists, but I see a lot of misinformation surrounding it, like regularly, and I'm not sure why. You know Holmgang, the Warrior Invulnerability? That skill that a lot of people claim has a knockback immunity attached to it, and an equal number of people that claim no, it doesn't, that's silly. Well, it's true that there's no knockback immunity attached to it, but there used to be. In patch 2.1 they even added this effect: enemies will now be pulled towards the caster. Obviously it didn't affect bosses, but it was super cool. But Holmgang used to have the effect, draws target towards caster, and binds both. There was even a bug fix in patch 2.15 where Holmgang wasn't working as intended, and the fix fixed an issue wherein warriors could be knocked back even while under the effect of Holmgang. So yeah, it used to exist, but no longer. A little quirk of times gone by. If you've done all your job quests, especially on Monk, you've almost certainly seen this buff on enemies at some point. This is an old Monk ability called Featherfoot. Featherfoot is something that is just so far removed from current FF14 skill sets that I think newer players will be shocked that it was even a thing in the first place. Featherfoot increases the player's evasion for 15 seconds, making it more likely that they can entirely dodge an incoming attack. But that wasn't all. Monk had an offensive tied to this weird niche defensive. You might recognize this icon somewhat. It looks like something we've seen a bunch, but different in terms of coloration. But this is not Arm's Length. This is Haymaker. Haymaker was an attack that you could only use immediately after evading an enemy attack, dealing damage and applying a slow. Speaking of knockback immunity actions, back in the olden days, Paladin was very special in that they were the only tank that had access to one that wasn't tied to their invuln. They could use Tempered Will on a 3-minute cooldown, immediately curing Bind and Heavy while simultaneously preventing most knockback and draw-in effects. This meant that in encounters like Sophia, Paladin had a very unique advantage that they could make full use of. Situational tools like this that weren't role-wide definitely made you feel rewarded for bringing a particular job that could use those tools in important scenarios. The game is better for implementing them across the board, but I definitely somewhat miss that feeling that we used to get. Seeing as we're talking about removed abilities, I think it's that part of the video where I stand at my pulpit and preach for a little while about my favourite ability in Final Fantasy XIV, which is sadly no longer with us. In Stormblood, Scholar had an ability called Miasma II. This one went through the ringer, honestly, being added in patch 2.0, then removed in 4.0, before being reintroduced in 4.05, then finally, permanently placed to rest with the release of Shadowbringers in 5.0. In its final iteration, it was an AoE damage over time spell that lasted for 12 seconds, and required you to be in melee range to use. It was an instant cast, but it was on the GCD, and it came with a high mana cost to execute. But what made it really interesting to me is that Miasma II was a DPS gain on single target. This meant that a big chunk of Scholar's damage optimization, as well as maintaining their other dots and using a lot of broil, revolved around using your Miasma II smartly. You wanted to use them for movement, but doing so meant that you needed to be in melee range, so your positioning mattered a decent amount. You wanted to use it as much as possible without clipping the dot or running out of MP, giving you this engaging, constant balancing act of keeping enough mana to heal or res if needed, never letting yourself cap out, having enough for movement, and it just felt so good to piece together a plan that worked. I'd love to see the risk-reward ideology of Miasma II applied to other abilities in Dawntrail and re-implemented to some jobs, because that can make one single button in a kit extremely impactful and center a lot of gameplay focus and depth on a job without bloating a rotation. One thing that I randomly just remembered while recording this, I didn't even write it down, was that before patch 4.0, the only way that Paladin could realistically gain aggro of a large number of targets was by using a skill that did no damage at all. They would use Flash, which would generate a ton of enmity on all nearby enemies and also bind them for 12 seconds, but it just didn't do any damage. This made Paladin by far the weakest tank in those AoE situations until Stormblood. This one's a weird one too actually. Feint has existed since patch 2.0, but as you'll see by its icon, it didn't exactly look the same back then. It was a Lancer weapon skill that did a moderate amount of damage and applied a slow. And honestly, it wasn't very good and you didn't really use it. But that is because it was actually a Bard skill. So you've probably heard of Caster Bard. In Heavensward, Bard would spend a lot of their GCDs doing half casts, and as a result, they actually had kind of limited movement to work around. They would use Feint whenever they needed to move for extended periods of time, because it wouldn't be subject to cast bars, allowing them to much more easily get around in a pinch while still doing some damage. This was a pretty fun application of cross-class skills, and there was some cool optimization you could do there as well. The origin point of a weapon skill basically never used it, but then another job found an application that really helped them out a lot. It was very cool. Speaking of Dragoon, they also had one of the least fitting abilities you can even think of. Keen Flurry increased their parry rate by 40%. You know, in case you fancied a little bit of tanking action in between your Dragonfire dives. There was a lot of random stuff like this in old FF14, just abilities that had such fringe use cases or were clearly designed with solo play in mind, that often they were considered worthless and were dropped either with the release of Heavensward or Stormblood. Now that I've gone through all these removed or completely reworked FF14 abilities, I'm getting a lingering sense of lethargy, which is available for Thaumaturge and Black Mage from level 42, and can be used to inflict the target with a 20% slow and heavy for 12 seconds, which I'm sure we can all agree is extremely useful, and I cannot believe it got removed in Stormblood. What's crazy about this is that after talking about removed skills for over 10 minutes now, I've barely scratched the surface. There's so many I didn't get round to yet, and if there's interest, please let me know in the comments section, and I will get round to them in an additional video. Who knows, with Dawntrail releasing soon, it's kind of likely we're going to be adding a couple more entries to that list, which is the ability you'd love to see reintroduced if you could, and why do you want it back? I'm really interested to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.